Tonight, Laura Ingraham thought she was about to deliver the ultimate takedown of Denzel Washington, a man she had mocked for years as nothing more than a Hollywood preacher. But what unfolded in the next 30 minutes stunned everyone watching. This wasn't just a debate. It became a moment that exposed the cost of lies, the power of quiet conviction, and the instant when a studio designed to humiliate a guest turned into a stage for truth. The studio lights at Fox News ignited in a blinding wash of white, bathing the set in an almost surgical clarity that left no corner untouched. Every camera was already rolling, each red recording light blinking like the eyes of an audience that demanded something raw, something that could not be rehearsed away. Laura Ingraham sat perfectly composed in her navy blazer, her smile sharp and controlled, the expression of someone who believed she was moments away from delivering a blow that would echo far beyond these walls. In her right hand, she held a thick manila folder, its edges worn from being studied and restudied. Inside it, she claimed, was a clip never before seen by the public, proof, she insisted, that Denzel Washington was nothing more than a polished fraud in a tailored suit. Across from her, Denzel sat with his hands calmly folded on the table. He did not shift in his chair or glance toward the crew bustling behind the cameras. His posture was almost unsettling in its stillness, as if he had already weighed whatever accusations might come and decided they would not move him. The audience could see it even before he spoke. He was not here to plead. He was here to be measured against the truth. Somewhere behind the glass of the control room, a producer whispered the countdown. 10 seconds to air, 9. The floor director raised his hand. 8. Another producer adjusted the teleprompter, though Laura had little intention of reading it tonight. She had rehearsed this introduction in her mind so many times it had begun to feel like destiny. 7. 6. The sound engineer turned a dial to bring in the theme music. 5. Laura pressed her palm over the folder one more time, as if reassuring herself it was still there. 4. 3. Denzel exhaled quietly, the only sign that he was even aware of the cameras. 2. 1. A chime sounded, and Laura's voice cut through the air like a blade. Good evening. I'm Laura Ingraham, and tonight we have a conversation America has been waiting for. She didn't look at Denzel as she said it. She looked directly into camera one, her eyes hard. She paused, just long enough for viewers at home to lean forward in their chairs. Because sometimes, she continued, the most celebrated voices in this country are hiding truths they hope you never discover. Her fingers tapped the folder almost casually, but everyone watching knew it was no accident. She wanted the moment documented, the precise second when she set the trap. In that silence, the studio felt like it was holding its breath. This wasn't a standard interview. This was a courtroom masquerading as primetime television, and Laura had appointed herself both prosecutor and judge. Denzel shifted just enough to cross one leg over the other, his expression unchanged. The corners of his mouth lifted, not a smile exactly, more an acknowledgement that he had been waiting for this performance. And perhaps, in some part of himself, he welcomed it. Laura took her time opening the folder. A whisper of paper sliding free seemed impossibly loud in the hush. She laid the top page flat on the table between them, a single line of typed text that no one else could see. Her eyes flicked back to the camera, as if daring the country to turn away. For months, she said, her tone low and deliberate, I have watched this man stand on stages, deliver speeches about unity and decency, and position himself as the moral compass of America. But tonight, she let her voice trail off for effect. Tonight we're going to look past the applause and ask who he really is when the cameras aren't rolling. She lifted her chin, fully aware that this was the kind of moment that would be replayed in highlight reels and dissected on talk radio before the night was over. She had crafted it with that purpose in mind. In her imagination, she could already hear the headlines, Laura Ingraham exposes Hollywood hypocrisy. Denzel didn't flinch. His gaze remained steady, as if he were not sitting under a grid of lights with millions watching, but somewhere quiet, somewhere private, where he could hear his own thoughts without interruption. For an instant, something in Laura's composure shifted, a flicker of recognition that perhaps he would not be as easy to unravel as she hoped. The cameras zoomed in, framing them side by side. A man famous for telling stories that made people believe in their better selves. A woman determined to prove he was simply another opportunist cloaked in eloquence. The stage was set. The jury was the American public. And in that moment, before the first question was spoken, the air itself felt charged with the possibility that the next 30 minutes might change everything. Behind the blaze of studio lights and the steady red glow of recording indicators, there was a quieter history unfolding, a story that had been years in the making. For all the performance of tonight, this was not the first time Laura Ingraham and Denzel Washington had found themselves on opposite ends of a cultural battlefield. It was simply the first time their conflict had been given such an unblinking stage. Long before this broadcast was scheduled, Laura had made Denzel a favorite target of her monologues. She never bothered to conceal her disdain. In segment after segment, she dismissed him as a Hollywood moralist who lectured working Americans from the comfort of red carpets and luxury suites. She called him the actor who thought he was a philosopher, the man who believed a golden statue in his living room made him qualified to tell the rest of the country how to live. Her words were chosen carefully, designed to pierce the armor of public goodwill that seemed to surround him wherever he went. More than once, she had turned her attention to his foundation, the Future Scholars Fund, the nonprofit he had launched to help underprivileged students access higher education. To her audience, she framed it as little more than a tax shelter dressed up in inspirational language. In one particularly cutting broadcast, she had waved a printout of the Foundation's annual report and declared, "This is what happens when a movie star decides he is the conscience of America." It was a line that went viral in certain circles, repeated by commentators who had never bothered to check the facts themselves. Denzel, for his part, had never responded directly. He had learned a long time ago that public battles often did more to amplify an attacker's platform than to defend one's own integrity. Instead, he let his work speak for itself. While Laura's team scoured for any scrap of evidence to reinforce their narrative, he continued visiting schools across the country, sitting in gymnasiums with teenagers who could not believe he had shown up to hear their stories. He never traveled with cameras unless the event required it. He never announced his donations in press releases. The contrast between them was not merely professional, but almost philosophical. Laura believed that public figures owed their success to an audience that had every right to scrutinize and ridicule them. To her, fame was a contract. If you took the adoration, you took the contempt. Denzel believed that visibility was a responsibility, not an invitation to be dehumanized. He had watched too many of his peers shrink under the weight of endless criticism and decided he would rather be underestimated than perform a caricature of himself for anyone's approval. Tonight's confrontation had been inevitable. Over the past year, Laura had sharpened her narrative until it was as honed as the folder she now rested her palm upon. She had repeated it so often that some viewers accepted it as truth. That Denzel Washington was no different than the rest of the coastal elite, that his sermons about unity and opportunity were nothing but lines rehearsed like any other script. She said he was dangerous precisely because he sounded sincere. He could look into the camera with that calm conviction and convince people he cared, even when he was padding his brand. Her language grew more scornful each time she revisited the topic. She called him the high priest of Hollywood hypocrisy. She mocked the Future Scholars Fund as a redemption campaign for an aging celebrity who needed relevance. She referred to his work with formerly incarcerated youth as a hobby, a shallow performance to appease his own conscience. Yet the more she repeated these accusations, the more her fascination became evident. In editorial meetings, producers noticed that she lingered over stories involving him. Whenever a new headline appeared, an award, an interview, an op-ed, Laura clipped it and set it aside. She claimed it was because she planned to hold him accountable, but some wondered if it was something more complicated. A kind of obsession with tearing down a figure she could never quite unmask. Denzel, in the meantime, was living a life that defied simple narratives. He funded scholarships without demanding gratitude. He spoke to young men in prison classrooms without bringing reporters. He testified before Congress about the importance of re-entry programs for former inmates. Every action he took seemed to contradict the version of him that Laura described. Still, he knew public perception could be shaped by repetition, and he understood the power Laura wielded over her audience. A single segment on her show could spread across social media like a spark to dry grass. He knew that tonight was not about facts alone. It was about the spectacle, about who would command the story when the credits rolled. And so he had prepared. For weeks, his team compiled records, correspondence, and financial statements to ensure that every claim he made could be proven on demand. They gathered testimonials from students whose lives had been transformed by future scholars. They tracked down data showing how recidivism rates dropped in communities where his programs operated. Every document was organized into folders now tucked in the leather case at his feet. But none of that preparation could change what Laura wanted from this moment. She wanted to break the illusion. She wanted to show America that behind the warm voice and thoughtful interviews was nothing but ambition. She had convinced herself that if she could pull back the curtain, she would find something hollow. And perhaps that was why, as she began her opening statement, her hand never left the folder. It was as if she needed to feel it there, a talisman of her own certainty. The cameras drank in every detail. Her unblinking stare, his measured stillness. Two people who had spent years circling each other through headlines and broadcasts, now finally seated at the same table, with nothing left between them but the truth they each believed belonged to them alone. Laura waited until the last echo of her introduction faded before she made her move. She adjusted the papers on her desk with the slow deliberation of someone savoring every second of anticipation. Then she looked up, fixing Denzel with an expression that blended politeness with something far colder. Her voice dropped to a measured cadence, the tone she reserved for moments she believed would become headlines. "Mr. Washington," she began, "you have spent decades cultivating an image of generosity and wisdom. You stand on stages in front of adoring crowds and deliver sermons about unity, about dignity, about lifting up those who have been left behind." She paused, letting the words settle, letting them feel almost complimentary. But as she spoke, her hand slid across the folder, drawing it closer. "What you have not been honest about," she continued, "is the network of organizations and causes you have supported behind the scenes. Causes that do not align with the warm, inclusive persona you present to the public." She lifted a single sheet of paper and held it between her fingers, the thin page quivering slightly in the studio's forced air. "On this document," she said, "is a record of contributions from your charitable accounts to a so-called community initiative that, in fact, has ties to radical groups advocating for the dismantling of traditional family structures." She didn't blink as she spoke, and she didn't look away. "You can deny it if you wish, but the evidence is here, and I think the American people deserve to know if the man lecturing them about morality is funding movements that undermine the very foundation of our society." Denzel did not move. His hands remained folded, the posture of someone who had decided that dignity did not require defense. But Laura wasn't finished. She laid the page down with exaggerated care and reached for another. "And let's talk about the Future Scholars Fund," she said, her tone softening into mock regret. The audience could hear the performance in her voice, the deliberate shift from accusation to disappointment. It's so easy for celebrities to wrap themselves in the language of charity, to tell us all they're here to help. But the truth is that your foundation has operated as a sophisticated shield against taxation. Millions of dollars flowing through shell entities, minimal transparency about where that money really ends up. A faint rustle moved through the control room as producers exchanged glances. They knew she was pushing the line between insinuation and defamation, but Laura had never been interested in playing safe. She thrived in the territory just past caution, where her critics were too outraged to think clearly and her supporters were too enthralled to question her. She leaned forward, her gaze narrowing. You have convinced an entire generation that you are their advocate, she said. But your advocacy seems to end the moment it threatens your bottom line. And if your foundation was truly about lifting people up, why do the records show so many payments to publicists, to consultants, to firms specializing in crisis management? She paused again, as though offering him a chance to confess. The silence was dense, the kind of silence that fills a room when no one is sure whether a person will break. Denzel finally shifted, not to answer, but to glance briefly at the row of cameras, capturing his face from every angle. The expression he wore was almost serene, an unsettling calm that made Laura's triumph feel incomplete. And then, as if she could no longer tolerate the composure in front of her, she went further. She pulled out one more document, a printout of a social media post from years before, grainy and out of context. She held it up between them like a trophy. "This is you, is it not?" she asked, standing beside an activist who publicly called for the abolition of marriage as an institution. Someone who has referred to faith communities as oppressive relics. "Tell me, Mr. Washington, is that what you believe too?" For a moment, the entire set felt suspended in that question. Laura's eyes gleamed with the certainty of someone who thought she had cornered her opponent at last. The floor director's hand twitched toward the cue cards, unsure whether to step in. And still Denzel did not look away. He regarded her, his gaze level and unhurried, and then he drew in a slow breath, the kind of breath that meant he would not be baited into a reaction he did not choose. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than anyone expected, so even and measured that it seemed almost impossible to reconcile with the barrage he had just endured. "Is this a conversation," he asked, "or is this a performance designed to convince your viewers that truth is whatever you repeat often enough?" His tone did not rise. He did not defend or justify or explain. He simply left the words there between them, an invitation to consider whether this was journalism or theater. Laura blinked just once, and the smallest flicker crossed her expression, an awareness that he was not going to crumble, that the man across from her had come prepared for every accusation she had rehearsed. But she quickly buried it, her mouth tightening into a line that promised she would not relent. In that moment, the tension in the studio deepened. The viewers at home could feel it too, the uneasy thrill of watching a fight that was about more than reputations. It was about which story would survive the night. And no one, not even the people in the control room, knew yet whose version of the truth would remain standing when the lights finally went dark. For a moment, no one spoke. Laura sat across from him, her mouth composed in the tight, almost sympathetic line she wore whenever she believed she had delivered a finishing blow. The papers she had so carefully stacked lay fanned out between them, each one a small monument to the story she wanted the audience to believe. But the quiet that followed was not the hush of victory. It was the charged silence that comes when a question has been asked but not yet answered. Denzel looked down at the documents, studying them as if he were considering their weight. Then, with a deliberateness that made every camera operator lean closer to their viewfinders, he placed one hand over the nearest page and slid it gently aside. He did not do it quickly or dismissively. He moved it with the same measured care he had used his entire life to set aside anything that was not rooted in truth. He raised his eyes to meet hers, and for the first time all evening, the softness in his gaze gave way to something harder. A clarity that did not need anger to make its point. "I'm going to answer you," he said, "and I'm going to answer the people watching at home, because I think they deserve to hear the full story, not just the version that fits neatly into your monologue." His voice did not rise. He didn't need it to. He reached down and lifted a folder of his own from the case by his chair, the leather edges worn from years of use. Without looking away, he opened it and drew out several sheets of paper, their official seals glinting under the lights. "This," he said, "is the annual report from the Future Scholars Fund. It details every dollar that has passed through our accounts. It shows that over the last 5 years, we have awarded more than 500 full scholarships to young people whose families could not have afforded college otherwise." He turned the first page over, revealing a second. "This is the independent audit," he continued, completed by an accounting firm that has no connection to me, no reason to embellish or protect. It shows that less than 6% of our expenditures go to administrative costs. That includes the staff who process applications and the advisors who mentor those students once they've started school. He laid that document down too, then pulled out a third. And this, he said, is the most important. This is the longitudinal study conducted by the Center for Social Impact, showing that in neighborhoods where our reentry programs have been implemented, rates of repeat offenses among formerly incarcerated youth have declined by 30%. 30%, Laura. He did not say it with triumph. He did not look around to see if anyone was impressed. He simply spoke the facts, each one layered calmly atop the last, until the story she had tried to build began to look less like a fortress and more like a facade. Across the studio, Laura's expression had frozen into something brittle. Her fingers flexed minutely against the desk, the only sign that she felt the weight of the statistics he had placed before her. Denzel rested his hands on the folder and paused. He could have stopped there, could have let the facts speak for themselves, but he seemed to understand that numbers alone were not enough to counter a narrative crafted to humiliate. So he leaned forward, and when he spoke again, there was a new note in his voice, something quieter and somehow more devastating than any anger could have been. Laura, he said, I don't expect you to agree with me. I don't expect you to admire me. But I do expect you to respect the work that real people have done, the lives that have been changed, the families who sleep a little easier because someone gave them a chance. He let that hang in the air, a challenge that could not be dismissed as easily as a talking point. The cameras panned slowly between them, the split screen capturing every flicker of tension in Laura's eyes. It would have been easy for her to launch another accusation, to raise her voice and fill the space with outrage. But she didn't. For a moment, she only stared at him, and something uncertain flickered across her face. And then, before she could recover, before she could gather herself into the familiar armor of certainty, Denzel spoke one last time. But tell me this, he said, his tone almost gentle. Do you really believe what you're saying? Or is this just the role you've chosen, the performance that keeps your ratings high and your advertisers satisfied? It was not the volume of his words that landed. It was the simplicity of the question. It was the implication that in her pursuit to expose hypocrisy, she might have become the very thing she claimed to despise. The studio was utterly still. Laura's eyes dropped for the briefest instant to the stack of papers she had brandished like evidence. When she looked up again, the brightness in her gaze had dulled, as if she was seeing the distance between the story she told herself and the reality she could no longer ignore. The control room did not cut to commercial. The producers understood instinctively that this was not the place to intervene. The audience at home needed to see every second, needed to feel the shift as the balance of power moved across the table. Denzel did not press further. He did not need to. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together once more. And in the quiet that followed, it was suddenly clear to everyone watching that the contest Laura had been so sure she could control was no longer hers to command. Laura did not look away as she reached for the last page she had prepared, the one she had saved for precisely this moment. She lifted it with a slow, deliberate flourish, her eyes locked on Denzel's as though she needed to see the first crack in his composure. The studio lights caught the glossy surface of the printout, a still image from a video, paused in the middle of a gesture that looked, out of context, like something it was not. I wonder, she began, if your viewers have ever seen this, her voice smooth as silk, but edged with a satisfaction that could not be concealed. She turned to face camera 2, as if she were confiding a secret to the nation. Because while you've been very careful about your public statements, there are moments, aren't there, when the mask slips, when you reveal what you really believe. She gestured to the control room. Roll the tape. A monitor behind them flickered to life, and the image resolved into grainy footage. Denzel was there, standing before a microphone at a community event nearly a decade old. The audio quality was uneven, the colors washed out, but the snippet Laura had selected was clear enough to catch a single sentence. one that, extracted from its surroundings, sounded damning. Sometimes people have to be reminded that not every tradition deserves to survive. The clip cut abruptly, freezing on his face in mid-expression. The studio seemed to contract around that moment, compressing itself into the tension between what she wanted it to mean and what it actually did. Laura waited. She knew exactly how this was supposed to play. He would deny, he would stammer, and the audience would see the cracks she had insisted were there all along. Her fingers drummed lightly on the desk, a rhythm that betrayed her excitement. Denzel did not speak. He did not glance at the screen or at the camera. He reached down, calmly, and retrieved a small black device from his folder, a digital recorder worn from use. His thumb hovered over the playback button as he lifted his gaze to meet hers. "I knew you would bring that," he said softly, so soft the microphone nearly missed it. The quiet of the studio made the words louder than any shout. "I knew because this is what you do. You look for a moment you can twist, a sentence you can cut from its purpose." He pressed play. The recorder's speaker filled the air with a different version of that moment. The same event, the same voice, but this time the full context unfolded around the sentence she had clipped. "Sometimes people have to be reminded that not every tradition deserves to survive," he was saying. When a tradition is used to justify hatred, to exclude people because of the color of their skin or the place they were born, then it's not heritage, it's prejudice, and we have an obligation to call it what it is. The recording ended. A hush descended so absolute that the hum of the studio lights seemed suddenly deafening. Denzel set the recorder down gently. His eyes did not leave Laura's. "That," he said, "is the unedited truth, the complete sentence, the entire idea." No one moved, no one spoke. The camera operator, without thinking, zoomed in to capture Laura's face. In the high-definition clarity of the feed, her complexion had lost its flush. She sat very still, her hand still poised over the papers she had expected would end this debate. Denzel's voice remained steady, unhurried. "I came here tonight knowing you would try this. I came knowing you would dig up every fragment you could find, and I came prepared to let people hear the whole story, because that's the difference between us. You trust that if you repeat something enough times, it becomes reality." He gestured toward the monitor behind them, where the frozen image still hung like an accusation without substance. "I trust that the truth doesn't need to be shouted to be heard." In the control room, a producer raised his hand to cut the feed, to throw to commercial, anything to break the moment that was unfolding like a verdict no one could overrule. But the director shook his head once, slowly. This was the reason people tuned in, and they would not look away now. Laura swallowed. The movement was almost imperceptible, but the cameras caught it. When she finally spoke, her voice was thinner than before, the certainty leached from its edges. "You're very practiced at this," she said, as if searching for an angle that no longer existed. "No," Denzel replied, and there was no triumph in it, only something that sounded like weary relief. "I'm just practiced at telling the truth." For a heartbeat, nothing else happened. The studio remained suspended in that rarest of silences, the moment when an audience realizes that the narrative they were sold is not the one they must believe. The camera drifted slowly over Laura's face, over her hand trembling against the folder she had trusted so completely. The red light above the main lens glowed on, recording everything. And in living rooms across the country, millions of people leaned closer to their screens, understanding that whatever happened next, the balance of this encounter had irrevocably changed. No one spoke. The stillness in the studio felt almost unnatural, as if the very air had thickened into something no one could quite swallow. The monitors behind them still displayed the frozen image of Denzel mid-sentence, but it no longer looked like proof of anything. It looked like an artifact of desperation, a relic of a strategy that had just failed before millions of witnesses. The control room, usually a flurry of whispered instructions and blinking signals, had gone silent. The producers were no longer scribbling notes or planning the next segment. They were simply watching, their faces lit by the cold glow of the screens, each of them aware that something had happened in this space that could not be edited or reframed. In the shadows beyond the main set, A cameraman shifted his weight, the movement loud in the hush. One of the floor assistants exhaled so sharply it sounded like a gasp. No one moved to cut the feed. No one dared. Laura sat with her hands folded tightly on the desk, as if she might steady herself by sheer force of will. Her gaze darted to the papers, to the blank space between them, to the camera lens that was still capturing every second. But she did not look at Denzel, not yet. Denzel let the silence stretch. He seemed to understand that the quiet itself was part of the reckoning, that there was no need to fill it with more argument or evidence. He rested his hands on the table, the folder of records closed now, as if it no longer mattered whether he needed to prove anything else. When he finally lifted his head to look at her, there was no defiance in his expression. No trace of the triumph she had expected him to wield, only something like sorrow, something older and heavier than any one conversation could account for. "Laura," he began, his voice so low that the microphones almost missed it, "the saddest part of all this isn't that you hate me." He paused. The lights overhead seemed to grow brighter in the quiet, every shadow dissolving so there was nowhere left to hide. "It's that you've spent so long teaching people to hate each other." The words did not explode. They settled instead, sinking into the charged stillness until the meaning became impossible to escape. Laura's eyes lifted to meet his, and in that fraction of a second, something in her composure cracked. The mask of certainty that she had worn so easily, the practiced confidence of a woman who believed her convictions could not be questioned, it slipped. Her mouth parted as though she might speak, but no sound came. Denzel did not look away. He held her gaze with the quiet insistence of someone who had carried this thought for years and had finally found the moment to say it aloud. "I came here tonight," he continued, "not because I was afraid of your accusations, not because I needed to defend my name to people who already decided who I am." His hands opened slightly, palms resting on the table as if offering something that could not be refused. "I came here because I believe that truth matters more than winning, that if you let a lie go unchallenged long enough, it becomes a weapon in the hands of anyone willing to wield it." He paused again, letting that idea hang between them, as heavy as any verdict. "I did not come to protect my reputation," he said, his voice steady but carrying something that felt like grief. "I came to protect the idea that facts still matter, that decency still matters, that we can disagree without turning each other into monsters." Laura's gaze fell, her eyes dropping to the papers she had brandished like weapons only moments before. Her fingers closed around the edge of one sheet, but she did not lift it. Her shoulders shifted, a small tremor running through her frame. Denzel drew in a slow breath, as if gathering the last of what he needed to say. "Because in the end," he said, "that's the difference between us. You think power comes from how many people you can convince to despise someone." His voice grew even quieter, so the entire studio had to lean in to hear. "I think power comes from what you stand for when no one is applauding." He did not wait for her to respond. He did not need to. He lowered his gaze for a moment, as if in respect for the gravity of what he had just placed between them, and when he looked up again, the studio felt changed. Laura's mouth opened once more, but her voice would not come. Instead, she looked down at her hands, and in that small gesture, every viewer watching saw the moment when certainty became something far more fragile. No one in the control room moved to interrupt. No one dared to pretend this was just another segment. The cameras kept rolling, capturing the quiet that followed as though it were the most important part of all. And in homes across the country, millions of people understood that they had just witnessed the instant when a debate about facts became a reckoning about character. The broadcast did not end with a triumphant declaration or a final cutting remark. It ended with a silence so complete that even the theme music felt out of place when it finally began to play. The credits rolled over footage of Laura staring at her notes without seeing them, her hand motionless on the desk. Denzel did not look at the camera again. He sat quietly as the segment faded to black, as if he had nothing left to prove. But in the minutes that followed, something rare began to happen. The control room phones lit up first, then the producer's private lines, then the newsroom switchboards. Viewers were not calling to complain or to praise. They were calling because they needed to process what they had seen, because it felt less like a debate and more like a moment that had unsettled something deeper than politics. By the time Denzel stepped away from the table, the first clips were already circulating online. A 2-minute video of his final words, "You think power comes from how many people you can convince to despise someone," was uploaded by a freelance producer who had recorded the feed on his own phone. Within an hour, it had been viewed over 1 million times. On social media, the hashtag appeared almost instantly. #DenzelSpeaksTruth. It climbed past sports scores and celebrity gossip and political outrage until it settled at the top of the trending lists. People who had never watched a full segment of Laura's show were sharing it, quoting it, arguing about it. Comment threads filled with thousands of posts in the space of an afternoon. Some were predictably partisan. Some insisted that Denzel had been rehearsed, that the entire confrontation was a stunt. But many more, even those who admitted they disagreed with his politics, confessed that they could not dismiss the simplicity of what he had said. One viewer wrote, "I don't like Hollywood preaching to me, but this didn't feel like preaching. It felt like someone telling the truth because it was the only thing left." An hour after the broadcast, a statement appeared on the social media feed of a sitting Republican senator. It was not the kind of message anyone expected. "I have opposed Denzel Washington on nearly every issue," the post read. "I still do, but tonight, I watched a man refuse to bend to outrage or self-preservation. I watched him choose facts over performance. I watched him choose integrity. We should all be capable of respecting that, even when we disagree." The comments section erupted. Some accused the senator of betrayal. Others called it the first honest thing they had seen in weeks. In the swirl of reactions, the sense took hold that something had shifted, even if no one could yet name exactly what it was. Back in the studio, the set had emptied slowly. Crew members moved with the tentative quiet of people who had witnessed an event they were not sure how to categorize. Laura remained in her chair long after the cameras were off. When she finally stood, she did so carefully, as though afraid her legs might not hold. A makeup artist approached her with a compact, but she waved it away. She picked up her water glass with a hand that trembled visibly. The ice inside had melted to slivers. She stared into it for a long moment before lifting her gaze to the silent monitors that still displayed her face beside his. Denzel did not linger. He gathered his folder and the recorder he had used to play the unedited clip. He thanked the floor manager with a polite nod and turned toward the exit without looking back. For all the intensity that had passed between them, he offered no parting words, no further explanation. In the hallway beyond the studio doors, a producer stepped aside to let him pass. The quiet there was just as dense, as though the building itself had absorbed the gravity of what had unfolded. As he reached the glass doors that led out into the lot, he paused. He turned once, only far enough to see the rows of empty chairs, the discarded cue cards, the lingering shape of the conversation that would not be forgotten. Then he inclined his head, a gesture of respect to something larger than any single argument, and walked out into the night. Long after he was gone, long after the show's official accounts had tried to reframe the narrative, the footage kept spreading. It moved beyond politics, beyond the usual tribal lines. Late-night hosts played it. Community leaders referenced it. A college professor assigned it in a course on media ethics. And in homes across America, people replayed that final exchange, listening for the moment when certainty began to dissolve, replaced by something harder to dismiss. They did not all agree with him. They did not all change their minds about who was right or wrong. But many of them felt, in a way they had not expected, that they had seen a glimpse of something real, a reminder that the truth does not require spectacle to be powerful. It only requires someone willing to stand there, unafraid to speak it aloud.